Welcome to the Birth Abroad podcast. My name is Megan Jennings, and I'm honored to host mothers who have come here to share their overseas childbirth stories. From fertility journeys to postpartum and beyond, this podcast is meant to hold space for women all over the world to share their unique experiences with the challenge of becoming a mother away from one's home country. Let's get in today's episode. Today I'm going to be telling the birth story of my first daughter, Macy. And as a little introduction, I currently live in Sweden with my husband, Johan, and our two children, Macy, who's 2.5 years old, and our son, Sander, who just turned 2 months old. So I am on maternity leave right now and starting this podcast as a little bit of a pet project. But Macy's story is the one that kind of thrust me into the obsessive world of birth work and my undying love for it. And also it is the inspiration for starting this podcast because I feel like my journey into motherhood as an expat mother was a lot more difficult than it needed to be. I was just completely unprepared for all of the unique challenges that comes with becoming a mother in a foreign country. So I'm going to share her story today to kick off this podcast. And as a little bit of a backstory to Macy's coming into existence, my husband and I met in 2010, so it's been about 10 years now. We dated on and off long distance for several years, and then at the end of 2014, we decided we wanted to settle down and start a family. So we decided we wanted to do that here in Sweden because there were a lot more benefits to starting a family here than there were in starting a family in the US. You know, the parental leave situation here is much more favorable than in the US. It's just a better place to raise children. Daycare is heavily subsidized, and there are child benefits and, you know, all other kind of things, nationalized healthcare and whatnot. So we genuinely thought it was only going to take us a couple months to get my residence permit. We applied in January of 2016, January of 2015. But unfortunately, we had applied at the same time as this global refugee crisis, where a bunch of Middle Eastern countries were kind of not in a good place, and people were essentially fleeing for their lives into Europe to seek asylum. So at the same time as we had applied for my residence permit, hundreds of thousands of people were applying for asylum, and it really bogged down the Swedish immigration agency, and what should have been maybe a 2 to 3 month waiting process for us turned into 14 months. But the whole thing was very uncertain. Nobody knew how bad it was going to get in terms of waiting times. And it created such a stressful and anxious waiting period of uncertainty. When we had applied, my apartment lease was up about a month afterward, and this was before we realized we were going to have a problem. So instead of renewing my lease, I moved back home, for instance. I sold all my furniture. I pared down all of my possessions. I adopted out my cat, who, you know, was a very close companion of mine. I had done all these things with the idea in mind that I was going to be moving, you know, in a matter of a couple weeks to a couple months. And instead, the waiting times on Migrationsverket's website were just getting longer and longer and longer. And we didn't know how long it was going to end up taking in order for me to get my permit. So it put a lot of strain on us financially and, just in terms of like emotional and psychological stability. Also, I was really scared that I was going to get fired because a few of my coworkers knew about my plans to move, but I hadn't told my actual employer because I didn't want them to decide they wanted to get rid of me before I had even gotten my residence permit. So I was keeping this huge secret, but they knew I had this relationship going back and forth. They knew it was getting serious. And so I was lying to them, telling them that our plans were that he was going to move to the US. And, we were in the process of figuring that out. I didn't know what else to do to secure my life. So with all of that as a backdrop, we were under a lot of stress already before I had even moved to this foreign country. So a year into our waiting process, I got approval from my work to visit Yuan for a month for the holidays. So I came mid-December and then I left in mid-January. And by then we had a general idea of when we were going to get our permit. We had a feeling that we were going to be waiting about 13 to 14 months, and we had already waited 12. And so we decided that month we were going to just have fun and try to conceive. We really wanted to have a family. We felt like we had wasted a lot of time. I was already 31 years old, and I was starting to feel that biological clock tick. But it also, on top of everything else, throughout all of my 20s, I had problems with cervical dysplasia. So I had had about 10 surgeries and procedures done to my cervix throughout, like, from when I was 20 to 28 years old. And I was told by my doctors to expect conception to be difficult, to expect it to take up to 2 years, and to expect to probably need fertility treatment help because I had so much scar tissue on my cervix from all these surgeries I had had done. So we, first of all, truly didn't think we were going to conceive the cycle I was out here. But secondly, we were really kind of stressed out that it was going to take us a long time, and we were tired of waiting month after month after month for my residence permit. So we decided to try to conceive just to make it feel like we had some sort of control, or that we were taking some sort of positive step forward in our relationship. But I hadn't been doing anything special. I remember I'd been taking the Whole Foods brand prenatal for, I don't know, maybe two months prior to us trying, and I was tracking my period on the Clue app, but I wasn't, tracking my actual ovulation or ovulation signs. I was just kind of going off of this fertile window date that my app was suggesting to me. So I came out here and we tried to conceive. And about a week after my supposed fertile window had ended, I started to experience symptoms that were very unlike what I would have expected to feel in a normal non-pregnancy cycle. Namely, my breasts were they were so painful it felt like a stampede of elephants had run over them, and I never get breast pain or tenderness at all. So that was like a pretty big sign. And then as the days went on, I was noticing I was getting a bit nauseous in the evenings. My appetite was off. I wasn't feeling really good. Some foods would sound really good, and then I'd eat them and they'd suddenly be super disgusting to me. I remember craving red meat and oranges, and I was a vegan at the time, so craving red meat was a little weird. And and I remember getting really, really emotional watching a Charmin toilet paper commercial. So it was just weird. A bunch of weird things were going on, but I pretty much knew deep down that I was pregnant. But my husband said that it was absolutely impossible. People don't get pregnant on the first cycle. So he wanted us to wait until the day my period had come and been missed before we took a test. So that day was January 15th of 2016. That was the day my period was supposed to come, and it was also the day before I was supposed to fly home. And so we went out and we bought a clear blue, just blue dye line test, and we took it at 7 p.m. that night. And I peed on it and I left it in the bathroom. I really wanted to be the one to go in and see it because I was afraid it was going to be negative, and I wanted a minute to compose myself before I went out and told my husband that he was right and that we weren't pregnant. But he wanted to be the one to go in and see it, and I didn't want to cheat him from that experience if he wanted to have it. And so I was like, okay, just go. And so I sat very anxiously on the couch when the timer went off, and he went in and he got the test. And then he came out from the bathroom and he looked at me, and his face was as white as a sheet and his eyes were literally the size of dinner plates. And he said to me very expletively that it was a positive pregnancy test and we were going to be parents. And I thought he was lying to me because he knew how badly I wanted this and how badly I thought I was pregnant. And, I just thought he was pulling my chain, but he threw it up into my face and he goes, "No, look, it's positive." And the test line, you guys, was like so much darker than the control line. It was definitely a positive test. So I got up onto the couch and I was jumping up and down and laughing and crying, and we immediately, we put the test into a plastic bag and drove to his parents' house and showed them it, and they were laughing and crying, and then we both called our sisters, and we did not wait at all. We couldn't contain ourselves how happy we were. So then at 4 o'clock the next morning, we woke up, we grabbed my suitcases, he drove me to the airport, and I flew home, and that was going to be the last time I'd see him until I got my permit, because we really couldn't afford to keep going back and forth anymore. So it was made all the more special knowing that I was bringing this precious piece of my husband home with me, this new little life. And it was so exciting and exhilarating and wonderful. It was so wonderful. It was one of the best moments of my life. So we ended up getting my residence permit approved at the end of February, and I moved at the end of March. So all in all, I did the first 14 weeks of my pregnancy in the United States, and I was under the care of my OBGYN in Los Angeles. She was the one that saw me through all of my cervical health issues and everything, so it was really nice for my first pregnancy to have a close eye on me. And she did a couple extra measurements of my cervix when we were doing transvaginal ultrasounds to make sure everything looked good, and everything looked great. But my first taste of prenatal care was this highly institutionalized, very hands-on experience. I had appointments pretty much every 2 weeks, starting at 6 weeks of pregnancy. I had 4 ultrasounds by the time I was 14 weeks pregnant. I had a 6-week one, which was my dating scan. Then I had an 8.5-week one. And then I had a 10-week. And then I had my nuchal translucency scan somewhere around 12 to 14 weeks along. I had the genetic screening done. I did the council panel. So it was tested for 250 different genetic tests or genetic abnormalities in my own genome. And then I had the harmony test done where I found out whether or not the baby maybe had trisomy defects, and we found out the gender. We were going to wait to actually learn what the gender was together. I got the paperwork faxed to me while I was at work. And we were going to reveal it to each other once I finally moved, but we couldn't wait that long. And so I had my coworkers, my close coworkers, all meet me in the break room, and my coworker Allie was the one to open it up, and everyone did a drum roll on the table, and and they told me it was a girl, and it blew my socks off because my husband and I were convinced it was a boy. But I think the only reason we actually thought that was because we both really wanted a boy for our first child. Looking back, I didn't have any symptoms other than this gut feeling that I thought I was having a boy. And then I packed up and I left and I moved to Sweden. So when I moved here, I think at 16 weeks pregnant, I had my initial meeting with my midwives here, namely because I needed to have my thyroid monitored. I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and up until that point, my panels were coming back normal, but I still needed to have it monitored closely. And so I met with my midwives, and I did a blood test and stuff, and then they told me that my next regular midwife appointment wasn't going to be until I was 26 weeks pregnant, which was 10 more weeks down the road. And it sort of blew my mind because, again, I was used to this super frequent monitoring from being in the US. So I had my anatomy scan booked for 21 weeks gestation. And then I had my first real midwife appointment booked for 26 weeks. And all the while, I'm a member of these due date groups on Facebook, which are largely populated by Americans who have this very hands-on medicalized pregnancy experience where everyone's going and getting more ultrasounds done, and they're doing their every 2 to 4 week doctor's appointments, and they're doing the orange drink diabetes test. At least in the commune I live in, they don't do the diabetes test unless there's like specific reason to do it. So like, starting at 26 weeks when you go in, they prick your finger and they check your blood glucose. And if that's off, I think maybe they do the glucose test, or if you have a family history, or if you like whatever, but we didn't do the glucose test. We don't do the group B the group B strep test here, at least in the commune I'm in. In the commune I live in, they don't even do nuchal translucency screening unless you're a certain age, or maybe you had complications in a previous pregnancy. So I had my first culture shock here, at least with prenatal care, in that it was extremely hands-off. They took an all-natural approach to pregnancy. They said this is a very natural occurrence in life. This is not like a medical condition. You are not sick. You just let your body do what it does, and, we'll monitor you as your pregnancy gets into its later stages. So initially that was a tough pill for me to swallow because I like data and I was used to being monitored, and I was already sort of not allowing myself to believe that everything was okay. I kind of felt like I needed a medical professional to tell me each week that everything was fine. But instead, I was sort of transformed here, and I learned to I had a very spiritual experience with my pregnancies. I learned to trust my body and to just let my body do what it was literally evolutionarily designed to do, which was to procreate and to carry babies. So it was a really lovely experience. I had a super easy pregnancy. I think my only complaints are that when I was at the end of my second trimester, I got stung by a hornet twice, and I'm allergic to bees. So that was crazy painful and uncomfortable for weeks. And I was so scared that like the venom was going to somehow cross into the placenta and my baby was going to get sick. I also had a panic attack about, what's that? I can't remember what it's called. It's the cat litter disease that you can get. What's it called? Where like you need to be really careful about changing cat litter, otherwise you can contract a bacteria that can cross over the placenta. So I got really worried about that towards the end of my pregnancy. But otherwise, the only thing I can really say is that I had really sore feet in the last weeks of my pregnancy. And I guess in the beginning, I was really, really fatigued. I had bad gestational anemia, and I had, my thyroid did end up getting crazy. So I ended up needing to go onto thyroid medication and have it adjusted several times. But by the time I was like 20 weeks pregnant, I was not like tired anymore. So, we get to the end of my pregnancy, and mind you, I was convinced that they had my due date wrong. They put my due date at a date that I thought was 2 to 3 weeks earlier than it should have been. So I was full on convinced I was going to go 2 weeks, the full 2 weeks over my due date. And I was okay with that because I wasn't in any pain or anything like that. But I, to my shock, actually went into labor on my due date. I had no signs or symptoms leading up to it that it was going to happen. I hadn't lost my mucus plug. I was having like random Braxton Hicks in the evening, but nothing crazy. I was not like having nesting urges. I didn't feel like I was going to be having a baby at all. I worked out. I did a full 2-hour workout the night before I went into labor. And then when I came home from the gym, I ended up raking all the leaves on our property, which is like a couple acres. Like that was what I did. That whole day was just super manual labor. And I felt great. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up, decided to call my mom and just chat with her. And we talked for about 2 hours. She's in Los Angeles, so our time difference was such that I was able to talk to her at 3 a.m. in the morning, and it wasn't a weird hour of the day for her. And then at 5, I went to the restroom, and when I wiped, sure enough, my mucus plug and some blood-tinged whatever came out. And based off of what I had read in my apps, I realized, okay, this was like a pretty definite sign of labor, especially being 40 weeks even, but that it could be a couple days before I actually went into labor. So I tried not to get excited. I just went back to bed, But 15 minutes later, I got my first contraction, and then at 5:30, I got my second contraction, and at 5:45, I got my third contraction. So I rolled over and I told my husband I was having some cramping and I was going to get up and, move around a little bit, but for him to just keep sleeping. So he slept until about 7:30, and in that time I cleaned the house, I put the laundry away, I ate breakfast, I was timing my contractions. They were like 12 to 15 minutes apart, and slowly getting closer together. So when he woke up, we were like, okay, let's go for a walk and try to get this going. So we took the dogs for, I don't know, maybe like a 2 or 3 kilometer hike. Then we came home and ate a little bit more, and then we were playing video games. And it was about 11 o'clock in the morning when I noticed we had to pause our video game every time I had a contraction because I couldn't focus on the game. And we live 45 minutes away from our hospital. So at that time we were like, let's drive into town, like to where our hospital is, so that we're close to it. We can get some lunch, we can run some errands and kind of just see how it goes. And then maybe eventually we can go into the hospital and see what happens. So we did that. We went, we got food. And then my contractions were like they were about 5 to 7 minutes apart at that point. But once we had finally gotten into the city I was going to deliver in, they had spaced out from anywhere from 7 to 11 minutes apart. And I was getting a little worried, thinking that maybe, my labor was actually stopping. But they were getting more spaced out, but they were getting more painful. So after we ate, we went to the hospital just to get checked. And this was my second culture shock experience with medical care. We went into the examination room and a midwife met us, and she told me to lay down on the examination table. And in the US, I'm used to when I'm about to get any kind of intimate gynecological exam, I'm used to the doctor leaving. I can disrobe in peace. I get a little blue drape to put over my lap so everything is discreet, and then the doctor knocks on the door and asks permission to come in. I'm used to that. I'm not a very modest person. I was a amateur beach volleyball player in LA. I was used to running around in a bikini 24/7, 365 days a year. I'm not body self-conscious, but I am used to a certain level, a certain protocol when it comes to, intimate examinations. But to my shock and horror, as I'm laying down on the table, this midwife takes my pants on either side of my hips and pulls them down to my ankles. My husband was there, just wham, had that in his face. I felt so exposed and vulnerable, especially in the middle of having contractions. And, I had to in that moment just say, when in Rome, I can't fight this battle. I just need to get through this exam. So she checks me and she says that I'm 3.5 to 4 centimeters dilated. She could feel the head, and she said she's going to sweep my membranes. Or she did something that made me think that she was sweeping my membranes. And then she gave me a pad and told me to expect to bleed a little bit, but since I was not already in active labor, to just go walk around for a few hours and not come back until I was in essentially excruciating pain. So we left the hospital and decided to go get coffee. So it's Sunday afternoon now. It's maybe 12:30, 1 p.m. And we go to a really packed coffee house to get, a cinnamon bun and something to drink. But whatever she did to my cervix really, really stepped up my contraction game, and my contractions were now consistently 5 minutes apart. And they were painful enough that I was gripping the edge of the table at the coffee shop until my fingertips were turning white, and I was breaking a sweat on my brow. And I remember sitting next to a table with kids. I must have been making some sort of noise or had demonstrated some obvious level of discomfort, because I remember one of the girls, she was maybe 8 or 9 years old, staring at me and sort of elbowing her mom, trying to show her mom this crazy pregnant lady who apparently appears to be in distress. So I told my husband, we need to go. Let's go back to the hospital. This is not something, I'm just not comfortable right now. So we leave and we're walking to the car, and I have that quintessential crazy contraction in the middle of the parking lot, and some guy came running up asking us if we needed help to call an ambulance. He thought I was going to deliver the baby right there. So my husband's like, no, we're good. We're on our way to the hospital. We get to the hospital, they check us again, and we're now 4.5 to 5 centimeters, and they decide to admit us. So that was that. I had no idea about birth plan. I knew I wanted to have an epidural, In my mind, the epidural was what the women in America get, which is like stick a catheter in, you don't feel your feet, you don't feel anything, like everything is numbed out. I had no plans on getting into the tub, but the first thing they recommended when I got into the birthing room was to get into the tub. So I got into the birthing tub, which was wonderful. They gave me nitrous oxide, which was really nice in the beginning. We turned on some music, and I labored for a couple hours in there. And it was really nice. But then eventually they had a shift change, and the new midwife wanted me to... she wanted to check me, and she also wanted to get a continuous heart monitor strip on the baby for like 15 minutes because I hadn't had that done yet. So I got out and let them put the thing on me. And it was when I was on the bed that contractions really started to get painful. And my husband and I had this code word that when I shouted this word, it meant, get the midwife, I want the epidural right now. But until I said that word, I wanted to see how far I could go. My goal was to get to 7 centimeters before getting the epidural, but I just wanted to see how far my body could take it before I couldn't take it anymore. So it had been like 2 or 3 hours, and they checked me and I was 6 centimeters. So I had very slow progress while I was in the tub and in those like initial hours outside of the tub. And what I was doing was I was laboring on my hands and knees. I was holding onto the back of the hospital bed on my knees. And I didn't like the nitrous oxide at this point. It sort of made my contractions blur together, and it almost made them seem longer than they actually were. So I didn't inhale the gas, but I would put the mask over my face with every contraction and scream into it. I vocalized very heavily in my first delivery. And it was nice because the mask totally muffled the sounds I was making, so I didn't feel so self-conscious about what I was doing. But I got to a level where I was sort of frantic and trying to find a position that I could be comfortable in these contractions. And I ended up on the ground on my knees, and I got this contraction, and I screamed on the top of my lungs, Oklahoma! So my husband ran out and got the midwife, and she checked me, and I was only 6.5 centimeters now. So looking back, I know that I was slowing down my progress because I was tightening up my body with every contraction. I was literally tightening every muscle and screaming, at the top of my lungs, not like this deep, low, guttural moan that you should do. But I hadn't known any of this. I didn't take any birthing classes I didn't take any classes at all during my pregnancy because I didn't speak Swedish yet. And in my commune, they were only taught in Swedish. There were no English classes. So I just thought I would wing it and everything would go fine. And I really had no idea what I was doing. So the midwife brought the anesthesiologist in, and, it went great. The epidural was super easy to put in. And to my pleasant surprise, I didn't need a catheter. And within the first maybe 3 or 4 contractions, I could not feel any pain, but I also had feeling in my legs. I was able to get up and move around and use the restroom on my own. And I told the midwives, I'm like, is this how it's supposed to be? I thought I was supposed to be numbed out. And they're like, no. No, that's very rare that you get totally numbed out. You're feeling it just the way it should be. So I was like, oh, okay. Unfortunately, what I didn't realize was here in Sweden, they mostly only give walking epidurals, which is a combination spinal epidural, which is a different combination of drugs, and it's administered at a lower dose than like that standard full-on numbed out epidural that women get in the US. So I had no idea what I was in for because I thought I was going to have a pain-free delivery, which was what I wanted at the time. And instead, very, very soon after I got my epidural, like maybe within 20 to 30 minutes, I began to feel my contractions in my pelvic floor. And they got more and more and more intense to the point where I was screaming through my contractions again. And I told my husband to get the midwife because something did not feel right. I felt like I was feeling like an enormous amount of pressure in my pelvic floor and a lot of pain. Just go get the midwife. I need to know what's going on. So the midwife came in and she checked me, and my waters broke at that time while she was checking me, and she told me I was 8.5 centimeters dilated. And I don't ever remember asking her, like, what is going on with my epidural? Why am I feeling this? I remember just being in labor land and essentially not caring that I was in pain. Like, I was in an extraordinary amount of pain, but I wasn't panicking about it or wondering, why am I feeling this? I just accepted the experience as it was going. So, let's see. I think maybe 10 minutes later, I think I had 1 or 2 contractions after that. And I distinctly had a sensation that told me that my baby was ready to be pushed out. I yelled at my husband, "Get the midwife, she's coming." So he ran out and got the midwife, and the midwife checked me, and sure enough, I was dilated to a 10. So it took 60 minutes exactly from the administration of the epidural when I was 6.5 centimeters dilated until I was 10 centimeters dilated and ready to push. So it went rather quickly, that active labor portion. So I got on my back, and again, I had never taken any childbirth classes, and there was this huge language barrier between me and my midwives. They were not comfortable speaking English, and I was in labor land and not in a place to listen or struggle through Swedish as it was. So I didn't really know what to do with the pushing. I could feel everything. I didn't feel uterine cramping, and I also didn't feel that compulsive feeling to push, but I felt every contraction. I felt everything from my pelvic floor on down. I felt the whole delivery. I felt every contraction there in my body, and it was a desperate time. I was really, I would say I was suffering because I was not mentally prepared for what I was in that moment, and it felt like hours had passed. And I remember my midwife putting warm compresses over my perineum, which was really nice. But it got to a point where she was telling me, she was asking me, like, she was trying to manually open my vagina. Like, she had her fingers in there, it's like stretching the tissues. I don't know why she was doing that. There was no, like, cause for concern to get the baby out quickly. But in my mind, so much time felt like it had passed, and she was, like, doing these things to help me deliver. I sensed that, like, we needed to get the baby out right away. I did not know that I could just take my time with pushing. I didn't know it could naturally take hours. I just thought in my head, I've got to get the baby out. And at the same time, I'm suffering through the pain. And I had this moment where I looked over at the assistant midwife who was at my side. Her name was Kaisa, and I will never forget her, ever, ever. I looked at her with the fear of a millennium in my eyes, and just a look of just total fear. And I remember in my head thinking to myself, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this. And silently, she looked back to me, and her gaze just pierced my eyes, and she sort of tipped her head down a little bit. She smiled this just calm, peaceful, confident smile. Her eyebrows sort of raised up, and she nodded her head very slowly, yes, as if to say to me, yes, you can. No actual words were exchanged between us, but like volumes were exchanged just in that gaze. And the next contraction that came, as it came on, I realized the only way I'm going to get this baby out is if I push her out. So I decided in that contraction, against all the pain I was feeling, the ring of fire, I was going to push. And so I pushed, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, and I did not stop. And once I needed to stop to breathe, I took a breath and I kept pushing. I did not stop pushing. And I think like in 2 breaths, and in that one contraction, I bore my baby. My baby was born completely, from like her head just starting to crown to out in just that contraction. And it turns out that I had only been pushing for 30 minutes. So it had not been a long time, and I really just launched her out, and that would cause me a lot of woe in the coming weeks. But in the moment, it was the most powerful and euphoric experience of my life, and they put the baby up on my chest. She had a very short cord, so she couldn't come up too high, and I remember desperately trying to look at her face because in those last weeks of my pregnancy, I remember having this fear that like she'd have this big birthmark on her face. So I'm like trying to look for her face, and my husband was just at my side yelling to me, "She's beautiful, she's perfect, she's perfect, she's beautiful." That moment and that rush of oxytocin and the incredible empowering feeling of having birthed my baby in that way, feeling all that pain and getting through it, and oh my God, you guys, I can't explain to you the high I was on. It set the stage for my obsession with childbirth and pregnancy for now years to come. It was the best moment of my life, easily. And so they finally cut the cord after my placenta was out. Everything went fine in that respect. I did not have any hemorrhaging or anything. They cut the cord and they latched my baby immediately. They never took my baby. They didn't do anything. And I don't know if this is standard across the board in Sweden or just in my commune or just at my hospital, but it seemed pretty standard practice. I didn't write this in my birth plan at all, but they leave a woman who's just given birth in that room for 5 hours. And in that time, you spend just doing skin to skin with your baby. Everyone clears out of the room once they've examined you and done like stitches, if that needs to have happened. But they don't take the baby from you if they don't need to. They don't do the weighing and the measuring and anything like that until the 5 hours have passed. So I ended up tearing on the outside in 3 places. I had a second degree tear along my perineum, and then I had first degree tears along either side of my labia. The labial tears did not cause me any problems, but the perineum tear was horrible for me. I'll get into that in a minute. I also tore in a 4th place, but that was not discovered until I was 6 weeks postpartum, which I will also get to in a minute. But otherwise, they just let us have that time with our baby to bond. They brought us some sandwiches and juice, and it was just really, really beautiful. In Sweden, after you give birth, you go to what's called the patient hotel, or it's also called BB. I forget what the acronym is. BB. It's BB. But it's sort of like this recovery suite where you have access to midwives and lactation consultants 24/7. You just press a button. Most women stay 24 hours. Some women stay longer. Some women are allowed to leave sooner. I had planned to stay 2 days, but my husband was really uncomfortable in the room, and our baby was healthy and I was feeling fine, and we thought breastfeeding was going fine. And so we decided to leave pretty soon after I gave birth. I think it was like within 24 to 36 hours. So now we get into the postpartum recovery segment of my story, and this is where I struggled the most. And I really think that had I prepared myself more for a lot of the unique things about being in a foreign country, I could have had a much better experience. So first and foremost, again, I had a pretty big language barrier. And mind you, I gave birth to my daughter only 6 months after moving to Sweden. And that was after 14 months of a hellacious migration process. And so we were already exhausted spiritually, physically, mentally, and already really stressed out. And I also failed to mention throughout my entire pregnancy, we hand remodeled our kitchen and our bathroom. And that was a major source of stress for my husband because he did it all himself, like dug up our bathroom straight down to the concrete foundation. And there were a bunch of issues that we encountered, and he was in a lot of pain. He has a bad back. And so we really we bit off a lot more than we could chew. And there was a time crunch to get this done before the baby came. So we were just spent by the time we became first-time parents. We had also never lived together before. So we had only been living together for 6 months, despite having had a back and forth relationship for like 5 or 6 years at this point. So it was an extreme amount of change compressed into a very small period of time. In addition, I was moving from Los Angeles, where I spent the first 31 years of my life. Again, I was a beach volleyball player. I was used to sun and physical activity and social interaction and living in a big city and all these things. And now I was living on the Swedish countryside, where it took 45 minutes to drive to the nearest city. I didn't have anyone here. I love my husband's family and they love me, but I didn't have that really close and intimate relationship established with them yet. And we had some language barrier issues also. So I didn't have any source of community or support network. It's a 9-hour time difference between Sweden and Los Angeles, so I couldn't even call my mom at an appropriate hour of the day. Like the hours that I'm awake, she was asleep. So I had nobody. I had no friends and family. I had nothing. And I gave birth on September 18th, which was the very beginning of the fall season. So as we went into these postpartum months, I was entering my first Swedish winter, where we only get like 5 hours of daylight and everything is cold and dark and dreary and just lack of sunlight. And it was a bad time. It was just the perfect storm for postpartum depression to brew. So with that as a foreshadowing of what was to come, I had a rough physical recovery. My pelvic floor was just wrecked from launching my baby out so quickly. That perineal tear I had, I remember not being able to walk for 5 weeks. Like I was not able to leave the house and walk the dogs for 5 whole weeks because the tissue was so raw and sore and swollen, and I felt the stitches pulling at it anytime I moved. And sitting down and laying down from a seated position and sitting up from a laying position, these were all just excruciating for me. And it wasn't just my perineal tear, it was in other parts of like my female anatomy down there, and I couldn't quite figure it out. I could not like sit on our bed. It was so painful. And so I'd have to like sit on a book or something very, very firm, because like if my body sunk into soft seating, it would just pull on these stitches and tears I had. And all of this made breastfeeding really, really, really difficult to do. On top of all of that, I had horrible breastfeeding issues. I was biting down on a belt. My daughter's latch hurt so badly. And again, never took any classes on breastfeeding. I just thought it was going to come naturally. I didn't expect this level of pain at all. I had no idea that pain was not normal. I thought it was. I didn't have blisters or bleeding or cracks or anything like that, but her latch was impossibly painful. So, just every hour, I'm going through this constant pain, constant sleep deprivation, which I didn't handle very well. And, it wasn't a good time. But we noticed that our daughter was sleeping in longer and longer stretches. And so I thought this meant breastfeeding was going well and, we were getting through it. But at 9 days postpartum, our pediatric nurse came and visited us. That's what they do here in Sweden. They do house visits in the beginning. And she took one look at my daughter and said, "Nope, you guys need to go to the hospital. Your daughter is very clearly jaundiced." So she sent us immediately to the hospital, and we found out that our daughter had lost over 10% of her birth weight, and she was very, very jaundiced, and we were in a lot of trouble. And here I was thinking breastfeeding was going well. So for the next 6 days, my daughter and I were admitted in the pediatric ward, where we did every 2 hours, round-the-clock, weighted feeds. We would strip the baby down, weigh her, I'd breastfeed her, we'd weigh her again, see how much she took in, and then the discrepancy between that and how much the doctors had wanted her to take in, we topped her off with formula, which was traumatic for me. I know it sounds so silly, but breastfeeding was such an important thing for me and a dream of mine, and it was very clearly not going the way it should. I felt like I had starved my daughter and I had failed her, and that my body had failed me. I was enraged with my body. I was depressed. I felt so sad for myself. I felt like I was missing out on this opportunity, and I'm like a member of these due date baby groups on Facebook, and everyone's like showing pictures of how much milk they're pumping and how much weight their baby's gaining, and I'm not being able to do any of that, and I'm very shamefully, in my mind, feeding my baby formula. I had so much anxiety to leave the house because I didn't want anyone to see that I was bottle feeding my baby. I was afraid they were going to judge me, and see me as a failure or see me as someone who just clearly didn't want to have that bond with her baby or didn't want to go through that work. I beat myself up left and right. So I have all of this going on, and then I have this mystery tear that I'm starting to clue in on. I bled the full 6 weeks. It was not an easy recovery for me, but I was noticing my bleeding was also coming in a weird place, just looking at my pad every time I went to the bathroom or when I changed it. I was tapering off significantly with vaginal bleeding, but I was increasing with bleeding where like my urethra was, to be honest. It was the very top of the pad. And on top of that, I had horrible pain around my pubic bone, stretching downward to basically where my clitoris was. It felt like I had a shard of glass wedged in that part of my body. I couldn't squat. I couldn't sit down. I couldn't make sudden movements. I couldn't do anything that opened my pelvis without feeling like someone was wedging a piece of glass like up my clitoris. I don't know how else to say that. It took me weeks of begging the healthcare system here to listen to me. You know, everyone just kept saying, oh, it sounds like a normal recovery. You know, it's not going to be comfortable to recover. You just had a baby. You need to give it time. They made me wait the full 6 weeks before I could get an appointment with a specialist. And when I got in there, another culture shock experience where they made me just strip naked right in front of the doctor. You know, no changing room, no little drape to put over my body. I just like pulled down my pants in front of this doctor. It's just such a weird feeling. I don't know. And then what's worse is like the gynecological examination tables are on hydraulics. So instead of the doctor like kind of coming down to your level or whatever, like having a chair that lowers down to the ground, they stand or like sit on a regular chair and they press a button and the table goes up into the sky. So here I am with my legs spread wide open. I'm like butt naked and I'm going up into the air, and it's such a vulnerable and uncomfortable feeling. But finally they examine me and the doctor says, okay, you have a lot of bruising pooled at, you know, where your urethra is, and what I think has happened based on what you have described is that you have torn somewhere internally around your pubic bone, and every time you make a movement that sort of opens the pelvis or opens the pubis symphysis, you break that tear open, it bleeds down, you know, and the only place for that blood to escape is out of the clitoris, which was where I was having that weird bleeding. And I had a lot of bruising, which means that the blood was also collecting internally and was probably putting a lot of pressure on the nerves I have. And so that was the stabbing pain I was feeling. And they told me there was nothing they could do for me. I just needed to take it easy and eventually it would heal, which it did. But to be in this pain, I was having daily panic attacks. I would literally freeze in my tracks. I thought I was never going to go back to normal. I thought I was going to eternally feel this pain, and all the while breastfeeding is failing. I'm failing my daughter. I had no time or mental energy to dedicate to Googling how to pump or, you know, anything like that about how to establish any kind of supply. All I knew was I had very low supply and it was getting lower and lower. And I was away from my family and I had no support network. It was a really difficult time. So, I had postpartum depression very clearly from the beginning. I got my first postpartum period when I was 9 weeks postpartum. My milk supply dried up a couple weeks afterward, and then started a whole new hell, which I won't get into, but essentially, I decided at 10 months postpartum I needed help. It should not have gone that long. I should have gotten help much sooner. But I got sent to a doctor. I explained what I was going through, and I got diagnosed with postpartum premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is PMDD, which essentially is like an extreme hormonal imbalance that occurs once you ovulate. So I started Lexapro. I was only on like 5 milligrams for a couple months, starting the day I ovulated and ending the day my period started. So I was only on it like 2 weeks out of each month. Very low dose. And within a couple months, I was totally fine. And I was able to get control of my life back. All of my tears and like birth injuries healed, although sex was painful, literally for the first whole year postpartum. And I think a lot of it was also because I had pelvic floor issues that I never had addressed. But I needed medical intervention and a lot of help postpartum to help with my postpartum depression. And while I did have all these things going on, I had the failure of breastfeeding and the birth injuries and everything. Honestly, what I truly believe caused my postpartum depression was, number one, already being stressed out from the immigration ordeal. Number two, lack of sunlight, lack of support network, lack of family being around me, lack of, just going from one lifestyle and a place where I knew how everything worked. I had my comfort foods. I had a source of income because I had been working. I had my friends. I had my happy places, to a completely foreign country on the rural countryside, with nothing to do. It's dark. It's dreary. And then language barriers. I did not know how to ask for help. I did not know how to navigate the medical system. I didn't know how to find a lactation consultant and how to ask for help. I didn't know where to look for lactation supplements, let alone what they were called in Swedish. I didn't know about, how to find pelvic floor specialists. During my pregnancy, I didn't do any pregnancy classes because, we had language barriers. I didn't even try to look for English taught classes, which there are here in Sweden. I just didn't think I needed them, and I didn't think to look for them, and everything was so hard. And then there's some guilt where, I had my baby and suddenly, she was my parents' first grandchild, and suddenly it became clear, I had this revelation that I had selfishly taken my parents' first grandchild away from them. And here I am in this foreign country, their first child to have a grandchild, and they were never going to be able to have that experience as grandparents, at least the way normal people do. So I had a lot of guilt about that, and there was a ton of strain on my relationship for having moved and then all of a sudden becoming parents. And so all of this is really the reason why I've created this podcast. It's for people to share their stories and their experience with becoming a parent overseas, and how that affected them and their journeys, what kind of tips and advice and tricks and revelations they had in the process to maybe make the transition easier, or at least more easy to prepare for other women that are going through this. So my best advice, which I know is not helpful, but really, if you're truly in the same position I was, don't get pregnant until you have moved and settled in. If you can manage waiting, because it is such a huge thing. There were so many things that I thought I was going to be able to handle in my pregnancy, or in the first year of my kid's life, like getting a driver's license and getting my language up to speed and finding a job and all these things that I just thought were magically going to come to me. And it turns out that having a baby is really, really hard work. And when the baby's sleeping, you're not just sitting around twiddling your thumbs with all this spare time to do a ton of projects. So try to wait if you can, but if you can't, spend your pregnancy locating help. Figure out where the lactation consultants are. Figure out all the different specialists that you think you might need depending on the recovery and the birth that you have. Talk to your midwives about what kind of support networks there are, like parent groups or breastfeeding groups or whatever there are in your area, especially, classes taught in English or whatever your native language is. Another helpful thing is maybe plan for your family or friends or someone to come out and visit you after the baby is born, maybe a couple months afterwards, so that you have that to look forward to, so that you don't feel like you're so isolated and alone. Definitely have something on the books to look forward to. read and take childbirth classes and breastfeeding classes. Have yourself armed to the hilt so that if you need help, you can rely more on yourself, so that you're not so heavily reliant on foreign resources if you don't know how the system works yet or you're not comfortable with it. That's a huge recommendation of mine. And then also, honestly, locate a therapist, especially a postpartum therapist. You don't have to meet with them, although I highly recommend you do. When it came to my second pregnancy, I started therapy just so that I could establish that connection with a therapist, so that if I had issues, again, I was immediately in the system and I could go right in. But I would honestly suggest, if you're new in your country, your host country, or you're newly pregnant and this was maybe a surprise or something that might be difficult to you, get into therapy now so that the transition is a lot easier. You have someone who has your back. And if you find yourself spiraling into postpartum depression, or you think you might even be remotely going in that direction, you're in the system, you know where to go, you don't have to think, you don't have to spend precious sleeping hours Googling or anything like that. Definitely get yourself involved in support communities online so that you have like mommy groups to help you, even if at a distance. And vitamin D. If you come from a country that is sunny and you move to a climate that is cold and dark, depending on when you are giving birth, take an extreme amount of vitamin D no matter what. I don't care, just take it. It will be your best friend. So that is my birth story, and I do just want to end it on a happy note. I was still obsessed with childbirth and could not wait to go through it again. My postpartum depression was really bad. In the months leading up to getting help, I was actually self-harming, which I really don't want to talk about. It's not something that is comfortable to speak about, but it is what fueled me to seek help to begin with. But I just want to say it got that bad. And after just a small amount of medication and a couple months of treatment and getting a little bit more sleep, and like once I got my hormonal imbalance in check, my insomnia was going away, my appetite was returning, I was feeling a lot more myself. I was able to start running and working out and finding joy in normal activities again, and all of these things just sort of snowballed positively into feeling so much better. And I made a full recovery, you guys, physically, mentally, emotionally. It was really difficult for my husband. Once I had recovered, he actually suffered a really bad burnout and needed about 6 weeks off of work to recover himself, because he then felt like he was able to fall apart and didn't need to be strong to keep me together. So it affected our whole family, but we made a full recovery. And I'll tell my second birth story later, but we did end up going on to have a second child, and it's been a beautiful experience. So it has a happy ending, but it was an extremely rough road. And a lot of the difficulties, I think, came uniquely because I did all of this in a foreign country and I was totally unprepared. So take my advice for what it was worth. If you are a mother living abroad, or you are going to seek fertility treatments abroad, or you have had children and you're experiencing postpartum abroad, or navigating breastfeeding abroad, or whatever, any aspect of becoming a mother abroad, let me know. Shoot me an email. My email is thebirthabroadpodcast@gmail.com. Let me know briefly your story, and if you would like to share it on this podcast, especially if you feel like you have tips or tricks that could be useful to other women in your shoes. And I would love to hear from you. So thanks, and I will talk to you guys later.